Gonna wait a little bit for the attendees to come in. Ooh. Hello, and welcome to Rainbow Space Magic Con 5.0. I am Angie Fiedler Sutton. I go by she, her pronouns. I am a freelance writer that covers geeky media for the Geek Area, and I produce my own podcast. I'm also a sponsor of this convention. This is the Queer Joy, Queer Revenge, Queer Horror for the Modern Era panel. Before our panelists introduce themselves, I want to go over a few logistics. You're welcome to use the chat to talk to each other and share recommendations in a respectful manner. If you would like to submit a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function or put a question mark before the question so it's obvious for the tech person and panelists. There will be time for questions closer to the end of the panel, but feel free to write them as you think of them. After the panel, the conversation can continue on the Discord channel for this panel. So without further ado, let's go to our panel. Michael, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. I am Michael G. Williams. I write queer horror and science fiction and occasionally urban fantasy and occasionally whatever weird mashup of genres occurs to me in that moment of inspiration. My website is michaelgwilliamsbooks.com. I also co-host a podcast called Arcane Carolinas about myths, legends, and modern weird in North Carolina, South Carolina, and other places. And I'm going to ask the other panelists to introduce themselves, and I will start with Ashley.
Hi, my name is Ashley Grant. I have written a bunch of short stories that have been published in the last 5 years. Most recently, my book Empty Cargo was published in February. It is available on Amazon, where you can also find two of the books that, actually three books, I apologize, three books that my short stories have been featured in. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is at Ash Grant Horror. I do have a Facebook page, but as I've said on other websites, my Facebook page is more of a family and friend page, right? So, Tucker, if you would like to take it from here, go ahead.
Sure, I'm Tucker Lieberman. As far as horror goes, I'm most recently known for an essay in the It Came from the Closet anthology. And also I was on the Out to Get You podcast. So in those instances, I was writing about Nightmare on Elm Street and talking about the film The Shining. And I go by he, him. That is what people call me. My website is tuckerlieberman.com, and I'm findable as Tucker Lieberman on social media.
And Kristen.
Hi, I'm Kristen, or KL Noone. I publish as KL Noone, mostly with JMS Books, although previously with Less Than Three Press and a couple of others. It tends to be a lot of romance, but romance in various subgenres, urban fantasy, paranormal, historical, sometimes very high fantasy. In the not so secret day job, I'm also an English professor, and my areas are fantasy, monsters, superheroes, and comics, medievalism and adaptation. I'm teaching my monsters course right now, in fact. They get their papers in tomorrow morning, so we'll see how all that goes. And so I do a lot of work on the Gothic, kind of the history of monsters. One of the things we're teaching this semester is about 12th century werewolves. So excited to be here.
That sounds awesome. So I proposed this panel to Rainbow Space Magic because I thought it would be really fun to talk about horror right now, and especially queer horror. It feels to me like we're having a moment where queer horror is especially on the rise, especially queer stories seem to be especially the focus in a lot of really interesting and creative horror work that's being done. And I just kind of wanted to talk about, why that's happening. Why do we think that that's happening? I think that my theory on why that's happening at the moment is that this is one of the first times that queer creators of horror are getting to tell queer stories via horror openly. There have been a lot of queer people who have created horror since the horror genre began, but very recently, it feels like, is when people started to, in a more widespread way, create horror as openly queer people and say, I'm talking about my queer experience via this genre. So to me, that seems to be the case. But, and there's no wrong answer to this, I wanted to ask the other panelists first, do y'all also think that queer horror is kind of in a special place at the moment? Or do you think that it's always been this way? Kristen.
You want the historical answer. I do think we're in a really interesting moment, at the very least, where we have people who are openly saying, I'm a queer creator and I'm making this thing that is also queer. And historically, you have a lot of queer creators. We can talk about Bram Stoker for a while if you want. But there's a lot of queer coding. There's a lot of being very careful about what you say. There's monsters as metaphors. There's some really interesting linguistic things. We can look at, again, that 12th century France if you want. But we are in a really interesting moment where maybe for the first time, people are allowed to openly say, yes, this is what I mean. This is what I'm trying to say. And we don't have to play with the metaphor quite as much, but maybe we'll do it because it's fun. Of course, having said that, living in the US at this particular moment, there's also that really interesting tension of everything else that's going on and how open you want to be about that. But there is a sense of liberation to it, I think, and a sense of almost playfulness. Like, look what we can do. That's really exciting.
What do you think, Tucker?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it has a lot to do with a shift in perspective. So, whereas in the past it was implied that it was straight people telling stories about queer villains, now it can be told from a queer perspective. And so the queer person may be the monster, that could be the fun of it or the surprise of it, but the queer person doesn't have to be the monster. The queer person could be facing the monster or interfacing with some sort of forces. So that I think is new because it brings a new sort of consciousness into the film or the novel, um, and and readers and viewers can experience that in a different way because it isn't just a narrative or a trope imposed upon queer people to contain us and define us. It's more actively shifting the trope.
What do you think, Ashley?
I agree with that. I also think that collectively, the queer community has a larger understanding of trauma, and horror for me is always a release of that trauma. It's a safe way to allow everyone to breathe. So by writing horror and by allowing ourselves this space where we can safely say, hey, let me get this out of my system, that allows us to take back our own anger and our own experiences of what has happened to us. Especially if you grew up in a small town and you grew up in a conservative area where you might not have been as accepted as you were when you were growing up. I mean, I'm very happy that times are changing, but that wasn't always so.
Very much so. I think for me, a big part of it is that in some ways, this is probably not a very new idea, but in some ways, horror is the modern incarnation of Greek tragedy, you know? And a lot of my favorite horror, anyway, is about sort of the emotional consequences of the bad thing that happened, the dark secret, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that necessarily those sorts of horror stories have to also show like the whatever has been lost. It has to show what the good thing was that by its destruction or the person's death or whatever, that the tragedy was enacted. And so necessarily we have this like really unique moment where queer creators get to describe queer fear, which we have plenty of. I agree wholeheartedly. I grew up in a tiny town that's not technically a town, and the world today presents me with lots of things to worry about. And also, if we're telling the story about queer people, in order to enact that tragedy, we have to describe queer joy. We have to describe queer lives that are good. and like that people want to preserve, that people are willing to fight to protect. So I think that's a powerful shift in the horror genre. I think, Tucker, you really said it when you said we're not just the victims anymore, that we can also be, and we're not just the villains. We can be the heroes, you know? So what do we think that queer storytellers uniquely bring? We might have just answered this. I don't know. So let me shift that question a little bit. What do we think queer audiences specifically want to find in horror that's different from what non-queer audiences might have in mind when they come to this genre? I'm going to start with you, Ashley.
For me, and what I've noticed from a lot of my friends who are in the queer community who have liked my short stories, one of the things that they've liked about my stories, even when I'm not intentionally writing a story that I don't think is openly queer, is just how relatable it is to them. Because, I mean, you do put yourself in your writing, even if you don't see it. I mean, it's easier for people to relate to stories that they can see themselves in. And for a very long time, don't get me wrong, I love horror movies. I am an equal opportunist with a lot of horror stories and horror films. But there are horror movies that I love more than others because I too can relate to them. And I think that relatability and just that sense of knowing that, like, hey, this person knows what I'm going through, it makes it easier for the readers.
Kristen, what do you think?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And building on that a little bit, the sense of being the outsider, of being different in some way. Certainly for maybe us as queer people, you take that stance, but even someone who isn't, a lot of us have felt that way, right? We felt outside for some reason, we felt other, or we felt different, or we felt like not part of that particular group for whatever reason. And so to have someone tell a story from that perspective is powerful, right? Even if you're not a queer person, but you can look at that and say someone else has felt like this, someone else feels these things, and they can either have a lot of queer rage about it or queer joy, or they can find a new community. There's a lot of community building. I was thinking about Laura Westengard's work on kind of queer goth culture, being academic, sorry, but the ways that she talks about how traumatic marginalization leads to newly constructed communities that are outside the norm, that are queer in that larger sense, right? The historic sense. And that's something that even for non-queer audiences, I think is extremely relatable.
Oh, I never apologize for being academic when you're on a panel with me anyway. I have a t-shirt. I said on a panel one time before I answered a question, my answer is going to be unnecessarily academic. And one of my best friends and my husband immediately got me a t-shirt that says that. And it's like one of my favorite t-shirts. But they were like, that is such a Michael thing to say. So never apologize for an academic answer. I love that stuff. So Tucker.
Yeah, sure. Following up on that, I would just add that it doesn't have to be fiction. It can also be nonfiction because I'm seeing horror weaving its way into queer memoir. For example, there's The Long Hallway that came out about a year ago, Richard Scott Larson, and weaving a horror film into a story of his growing up and coming out and processing some trauma. So with that, I think it's important that people are using horror to explicitly tell nonfiction narratives as well, to explain things, and that regardless of whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I think queer audiences are excited about using horror as a way to communicate among ourselves or also to people who are not queer, like to explain things like this is my experience. And if you watch this film, you will understand something about me. Or if you read this nonfiction book, that uses horror elements, you will start to understand something better. I think it's a real communication vehicle.
Absolutely. I'm going to try to back up all the way to the beginning of the thoughts I have after hearing those. Like I said, grew up in a small town, and in the place where I grew up, it was perfectly okay to be a little bit into horror movies, especially if you were into like the right kind of horror movies. If you were into horror movies where the right kind of people suffered, then everybody kind of just assumed that you were just boys being boys, was, the way that I'm sure that a lot of people thought of it. But if you were too into horror, then that was a little weird. And so horror for me as a kid was this thing that like it was a little embarrassing, and yet I was really drawn to it. And I didn't totally understand why I was drawn to it. And in that sense, it was a perfect analog for my experience of queerness, of like, I knew that that was happening, and I knew that I could not talk about it with the people around me, and that the people around me would think that was weird, at best. They would think that was weird. At worst, they would think that that was violently weird. And the same kind of stuff happened. There was a guy in my hometown who wrote horror novels who got accused of murder by the DA in public for no reason other than that he knew the person who got murdered, and he wrote horror novels. And that was literally the case that the DA wanted to make against him.
Mm.
So there was a lot of ways in which, like, as a kid growing up, like horror and queerness kept like intermingling for me. They kept being good reflections of each other. But I also think that as a kid, I was really drawn to horror villains because they are so often queer coded. And I liked the fact that villains are powerful. Villains are people who have decided they want what they want, and they've been told that they shouldn't want it. And that has not changed the fact that they want it. And in fact, they've kind of doubled down and said, no, I'm going to go get that thing that I want for myself. And there is nothing queerer than somebody who gets told they should not want what they want, but they want it and they're going to get it. And they just don't care how many rules that we have to break to get there. And so I love queer coded villains because for me, they were great role models personally. That's not always a popular thing to say, but I love a queer coded villain. I just love that stuff.
Do you mind if I bounce off you for a
Oh
minute,
no,
Michael?
please jump in.
Because I had a very, very similar experience with an extremely conservative small town. And like you, I was heavily discouraged from writing horror, so much so that I was accused of being suicidal and was actually forcibly hospitalized at the age of 13. And yeah, my English teachers told me for years that, oh, your work is very good, but you'll never be published because you're too dark. Yeah, who got the last laugh on that? And
Yeah.
I think part of that was not only because I wrote horror, but because I was a woman. So it was like a double taboo for me. Because horror, first of all, wasn't really accepted in my hometown at all. Like my hometown was extremely Republican and extremely conservative, which was kind of weird because it was a northern state, but it was such a small town, like
Yeah.
ridiculously small town. And just that double of me being a girl who really liked horror. It was like, okay, it's fine that you read all of the Goosebumps books, but why are you reading Stephen King? That was like the hard line that they drew.
Yeah. It's really
Well,
funny to me to see people like decide that there's a certain degree of interest that's okay, and beyond that it's bad. And there's a lot of life that sometimes people tell us there's a certain degree of interest that's okay, and beyond that it's bad.
Yeah,
I
and
remember
as you
reading
say
Anne
that,
Rice for the first time and reading all the Anne Rice in high school. And of course, these days, some of that's quite a bit problematic. But when you're, 14 or 15 and someone gives you a copy of Interview with the Vampire or Vampire Lestat, and you're reading through that, and they're unapologetically powerful and very, very queer and violent and full of desire and lust and sex and trauma and all these things. You're like, I didn't know that existed. I mean, it's horribly messy, but wow, right?
Tucker.
oh yeah, as you both say that, Ashley and Kristen, I was thinking about how there is some gatekeeping or attempted gatekeeping of horror, the enjoyment of it, that has to do with gender and also with age. So around the time that we're often discovering ourselves as queer, or coming to identify as queer, we're also coming to assert an interest in horror. And both of those things are topics we get some feedback about, sometimes negative feedback, or are you sure you really want to do that? And so it requires us to assert our own interests. Like, yes, I'm a queer person. Yes, I read horror. A lot of that happens, I think, when we're teenagers or young adults. So maybe
Very
that's
much
how it
so.
comes linked together.
Hmm. I love that. That's oh, I'm so glad we're doing this panel. So to make sure we get to talk about some of the stuff that I know each of y'all specifically want to talk about, I'm going to jump in with Tucker, and we'll all like get to respond to this, but I'm going to start with you on this question. You mentioned in the email thread before this panel that you've been studying and considering the differences between horror and weird. I was wondering if you could talk about that and about the way that that intersects with queer perspectives.
Yeah, so I'm from Boston, but currently living in Bogota, Colombia. So I attended a class here in Bogota that's taught by Rodrigo Bastidas, who is an editor at Vestigio Publications here. And he was telling us all about the weird genre, the new weird genre. So under this definition, I'll try to keep it quick. Horror, the classic horror genre, can have, say, a monster and it has an explanation. So if there's a zombie, you know why the person is undead. Like there was a parasite or a virus or a magic spell, and the person came back to life. And the character in that story is going to be afraid of the monster. And we're sort of observers looking at that, and we have the explanation. Whereas weird, which sort of developed through the 20th century, is more like, as readers or viewers, we have not really an idea of what's going on, and that burden of fear is shifted onto us because we don't know. So the character in the story might have a best friend who's undead, and that might be pretty normal to the character in the story. But to us as readers, we're like, what the heck? It's a living person and an undead person, and they're friends together. We don't understand this, so it feels completely weird. So it's something that alters our sense of reality, and it leaves us with a sense of disquiet. So when I think of this in relation to queerness, I think about like, um, well, if we try to define ourselves too much, if we say, well, I'm gay and I know that I'm gay and I came out and I made some gay friends and that's what there is to say. It's explained. Here it is. Um, that doesn't completely contain the reality of our lives, which I think is why a lot of people use the word queer to say there's so much of this that is not defined. And we learn new things about ourselves every day. And sometimes it's a little weird and sometimes it leaves us unsettled. So that's how I think about it, where a genre like weird, where you leave some of the edges rough and unexplained, is also a good way to explore queerness.
That is such an interesting distinction to draw, and has never occurred to me, would never have occurred to me without hearing that explained. At first, I thought you were describing like cosmic horror as distinct from regular horror, but I see what you mean. Totally different. I can see like there's some overlap, obviously. Like it's not exactly a Venn diagram so much as it's like a big paint blotch, But that's really, really fascinating. I really love that. Huh. Does anybody have anything they want to throw in on that?
Well, we were just doing in class with my students, Jeff Cohen's monster culture. His fourth point is one of the things that monsters are, or one of the things that make them frightening, is the refusal to be easily categorized, right? That sometimes it's very literal. That thing is a werewolf, it's part human, part beast. That challenges your boundaries. But sometimes it's social, sometimes it's cultural. That thing is hard to fit into what I thought I knew about the world. If I accept that that thing exists and it's real, or that maybe that queer person exists and they're real, then I suddenly have to redraw all of my mental maps and categories for what I thought the world was. And that's a scary thing for people to have to do, right? Regardless of the monster or person itself, they might be very kind and sweet or benevolent, but the fact of that existence challenges those boundaries and those categories. And so if you're suddenly confronted with that, that is a frightening process. He's looking at things like the Europeans seeing an armadillo for the first time and going, well, what the heck is that? Right? But it's the same process.
It makes me think about, like, I've always felt that there was an inherent queerness in a lot of horror stories that don't necessarily on the surface seem to be like queer stories, like Alien. There's just something about it, there's just something in the character. I mean, there are queer characters in the story, but the story is not about their queerness. And I think it's never really occurred to me at a conscious level that maybe what I felt in those stories was that part of the threat is also the promise of whatever happens is going to be totally new, and it is going to change you, and it's going to change you in unpredictable ways and ways that other people are going to find dangerous, much like a werewolf story. Maybe that's what has always made me feel like Ginger Snaps was a really queer movie, even though it's about, as far as I can tell, nothing but cishet characters. But the fact that it's about a transformation of a person into something that nobody anticipated, I don't know, that feels like that could be really a lot worth me thinking about. I guess I know what I'm going to talk about with my therapist next week. So, Kristen, you mentioned that you are currently teaching a course on monsters. So, what can you tell us about that course and about queerness and monsters?
We do lots of monsters from essentially the 12th century up through relatively modern. I think the latest thing we do is actually a China medieval short story talking about the New Weird movement from the 2000s. So we cover a lot of ground, but we do the 12th century werewolf story, which is actually a deeply queer story. Um, I actually wrote on the creative writing side a queer romance version of it that does some really interesting things. If you know it or if you don't know it, it's Marie de France's Bisque Livre, and essentially you have a knight who's a werewolf who turns into a werewolf, as Marie says, as happens in that time, because people do. But the interesting thing in terms of queerness with that, and we do talk about it, is that he's arguably bisexual, and maybe even sort of question mark trans. Obviously, you can't apply modern categories to the medieval, but when he starts out, he's married to a woman who betrays him. By the end of the poem, he is living with the king and sleeping in the king's bed, and it's hard to get much more clear than the king kissing him and saying he loves him. And the translation, because it's very, very deliberate. Marie speaks multiple languages as a woman in the 12th century. The pronouns that she uses actually switch back and forth between the feminine and the masculine, which is fascinating. And as someone who speaks multiple languages, she's doing it on purpose. She doesn't do it in some of her other stories. So there's clearly a point to it. And so why is that, right? So we start with that and think about shape shifting and moving between forms and perhaps a kind of love that you couldn't express, or maybe you you can express because they do say I love you. But what does it mean to be a very queer story, to be human plus something else by the end? And then we also do some of the big things. We do Frankenstein as kind of our big novel length text, but we talk a lot about the framing narrative as well, the sense of loneliness, the isolation. When Captain Walton's out on the ice and picks up Victor Frankenstein, he tells us that he's lonely. He wants a friend. And that really is the frame for the whole book. It's what the creature wants, right? He wants a friend, he wants companionship. And when he doesn't have that and he feels isolated and alone, things go bad. And then we do a few other things along the way. We actually do Buffy the Vampire Slayer. We do the James Whale Frankenstein for some more 1930s queerness, right? Queer coded, obviously. Queer directors. Let's see, what do we end with? We actually get to a little bit of superhero comics because I couldn't resist. We do the X-Men to talk about superheroes and monstrosity and difference and otherness and social acceptance or rejection. So it's a very fun class, and we have lots of conversations, and usually my students get very excited about it.
Are the X-Men the first instance of monstrosity is what makes them a hero? I don't know. It's an honest question. I'm just like, it's never occurred to me to have those thoughts intersect.
I would tend to argue not, because you get it as early as probably Batman, because if you're reading the early Batman, like the actual 1930s and 40s, he outright says he's there to strike terror into the hearts of criminals, right? If you read the original, the Bill Finger origin story, he says he's there to wage war in the dark on the criminals of the night. And that's a horror story, right? He's there, he's trying to do good, he's trying to clean up the city, but he's using fear as his tool to do that. I do think the X-Men are maybe one of the early examples of a team that in social perception, because the way they're always presented is that society hates them, right, and fears them. So they take that complete lack of rejection and make that powerful in a really interesting way, especially in the 60s. Um, Bruce Wayne, when he's not Batman, is part of society, right? He's a playboy, he's high society, all that. So the X-Men are such a great metaphor for, well, what if you're the outsider? What if everybody does hate you, but you try to save people anyway, because that's what you choose to do.
Hmm. I love it. Tucker, Ashley, either of you want to jump in with thoughts on that?
Well, the book that was just published in February, it definitely does draw a lot of lines between just the Victorian ideals of horror and monsters, because it is a Dracula-based story, but it's told from the perspective of Renfield. So Renfield has no idea what's going on at all. And I'm not very good at writing psychological pieces, but I tried my best with this one. And it turned out pretty well, according to everybody who's read it, which was a good surprise to me. But that is actually one of the central themes is he has no idea what's going on. He's just working on this ship as a deckhand late at night, and all of a sudden he just meets this man who's promising him a better life, and all he wants to do is get to England. And he's like, okay, I can do that. Who are you? Why are you
Wow.
here?
I love that. Oh, I love that a lot.
I want to take the class.
Yeah. I want to take the class for sure.
I
Like
love
for
the
real, if that class gets
Oh.
offered online, you should let people know.
Just out of curiosity, have you all read some of the from a couple years ago when they're doing the Dracula Daily online? It's so good and so fun. Of course, now it's out in book form, and of course, mine's downstairs on the bookshelf. But they put out the gorgeous, like leather-bound one with the big red bookmark and everything.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone who doesn't know or you weren't reading along with it online, they were doing Dracula in actual chronological order, piece by piece, but with commentary, right? Like, what is Jonathan
Um,
Harker?
I
No.
did not, but I do have the Edward Gorey illustrated version of Dracula, which I got a couple of years ago in New York City. That was like my second ever time I was ever in New York City. My husband took me to the Strand bookstore, and it just happened to be right there. And I was like, okay, it's Edward Gorey. I need it.
Dracula is my favorite novel of all time. It has been since I stumbled across it at a Scholastic Book Fair in 6th grade. And I read it and was like, I feel like this book is probably about people doing it. And I am really into this version of it for some reason. So the notion of there being an entire book that is Renfield's experience of having a handsome stranger, a handsome and charismatic stranger show up and say, I'm going to take you places. That is phenomenal to me. And I cannot wait to read and buy that book.
I
Not
will
enough.
I will send you actually I've already posted the link on the shameless self-promotion um portion of the Discord, but I can also message you the Amazon link if you would like.
Please do. That sounds amazing. So I want to make sure that we get to everybody's unique specialties. So Ashley, you told us that you've been reading about queer villains. So like I said, I love queer-coded villains. I would love to hear your thoughts on villainy and queer villains.
Yes, I have. It's something I've always been interested in for a couple of reasons. One, the villains, they always get the most screen time. You cannot have a good story. It doesn't matter if it's horror or not without a villain. And the villain just makes the story. That's why I've always found myself more centered towards the villains, whether they're queer coded or not. But a lot of villains, especially in modern history, whether it's a Disney movie or whether it's a horror, and I know this is going to be a bizarre comparison, but Disney's Ursula is probably one of my best examples of a wonderfully made queer coded villain, especially because she was deliberately designed after one of the greatest drag queens of all time, Divine. And she is just a wonderful character all around. She's also the only one in the entire movie that actually has common sense if you listen to her. And her voice actress, Pat Carroll, did a wonderful job.
That's magnificent.
Yeah. She
I
did have a
But
good voice.
also,
yeah.
yeah, but also if you think of Jennifer's Body, which is a much more recent horror movie compared to, Disney's The Little Mermaid, which is not horror at all. There are definitely parallels that you can draw between Ursula and Megan Fox's character, Jennifer. But I love Jennifer's Body because that movie is so dumb, but it is so great because it takes the common teen horror trope and the common teen don't have sex fear tactic and it spins it on its head and it makes it into this chaotic bi story that is just hilarious to watch. And it's not even that it just makes it at the end of it's like, oh, okay, now she's going to go after her best friend. No, they tell you from the very beginning that this is going to happen. It's not a surprise. They're very open about the fact that Megan Fox's character is bisexual.
I love the fact that another reason why I always loved queer villains as a kid was villains are very flamboyant. Villains are very expressive. Heroes are expected to be restrained. They're expected to be just like the boringest person on the entire thing. That's part of what makes Zap Brannigan in Futurama such an effective spoof of heroes. He's a hero who's allowed to be flamboyant and cowardly. And he's not really a hero, but he thinks of himself as a hero, but he also allows himself to be very flamboyant. I love villains for their flamboyancy. I just love how extreme they are. I love how every villain is a little extra. Anybody else want to jump in with thoughts on that?
I'm just thinking about all the Disney villains that I absolutely love. Maleficent and the robes and the headdress with the horns, or even Scar from The Lion King, who gets absolutely the best song, right? They get to give the best performances because it's so unrestrained, right? You can say or do or sing or dress however you want. You don't have to heroically uphold the social and cultural norms.
Every Disney villain is basically a drag queen or drag king waiting to happen.
Oh
So,
yes.
oh yeah.
Sure.
So, what are some of y'all's favorite resources for people who want to read more, watch more, discuss this stuff more? What are some of the things that you recommend? What are the things that you're always trying to get somebody else to watch about queerness and horror?
I did bring one of the books that I told you I had read in preparation for this panel. I've actually brought it in my office today. I know I have it word out, but this is Queer Villains of Myth and Legend by Dan Jones. It is just a wonderful introduction to queer coded villains and just myths in general. It is a great book. It's not very long. I mean, each character he mentions only has like maybe 3 to 4 pages, but it's just excellent. And it starts at the very beginning. It starts with Greek mythology and then it goes all the way to the modern age. It covers everything from Medusa to Dracula to Frankenfurter. It's just a great read. I couldn't recommend it more.
Love it. Tucker.
Oh, cool. Well, as far as resources that will themselves give you huge lists of things to check out, a few years ago, Sumiko Salson came out with a list called 100 Black Women in Horror. So that is a wonderful resource. And also, there's a brand new book came out 2 months ago called Corpses, Fools, and Monsters: The History and Future of Transness in Cinema by Willow McClay and Caden Gardner. So that's got a long list of films, and not all of them are horror films. They all have some sort of trans representation in them, but even in the cases where it's not directly a horror film, it gives you broader context. So you can see, well, audiences at this time were watching this kind of trans representation in film. And so when there was a horror film that represented a trans person, that's the archetype of a trans person they had, or the stereotype or the assumptions they had. Also another one, New Queer Horror, Film and Television by editors Darren Elliott Smith and John Edgar Browning, published in 2020, has a lot of films that I would love to check out. There's always more to watch.
Oh, the John Edgar Browning. I actually used one of his YouTube videos from back when he was still a PhD candidate in week 1 or 2 of my monsters class. We watched one of his little 10-minute intro videos. And it's so funny because you're so young, this is PhD candidate John, and now he's, out editing one of the absolutely awesome recent texts.
That is such a cool connection.
Yeah.
I feel like I should send you all the link to that one.
Oh, please do.
Yeah.
Please
Please.
do.
Yeah. I can throw out a few podcasts too. There's a new podcast called Wizards and Spaceships by Rachel Rosen and David Klink. And so the first episode had some horror references in it. And then the last episode they just came out with was about the far right, which is a whole other scary topic. But like sci-fi that the far right has latched onto or used to promote far right tropes. So we could get into political horror, that's another thing. But that's the Wizards and Spaceship podcast. And also there's the Out to Get You podcast, Margot Motter and Becca Gold. And Our Opinions Are Correct, of course, Charlie Jane Anders and Annalie Newitz I listen to. They talk about sci-fi.
Nice.
I think you covered at least one of the books I was going to mention, which was John's book, but Jeffrey Cohen's work on monster culture, which we use for the monsters course to go through his kind of 7 proposed functions of monsters. George Haggerty's work on the queer Gothic, which is fantastic, all about hauntings and returns and secrets that bubble up that you can't keep hidden, and sometimes about giant suits of armor that fall on you and squish you. And then I mentioned Laura Westengard's work on goth queer culture, which is excellent, from a couple of years ago. Let's see, what hasn't come up? There was, as far as film, there was a fairly good kind of 4-part The Queer for Fear documentary from, was that last year or the year before, produced by Brian Fuller, that looks at all the queer creators and the long history of horror, everything from like James Whale up to today, things like Hannibal, for instance. Let's see, what else?
I probably shouldn't think Hannibal, the show, was as hot as I do, but I think it was just like ridiculously hot.
Oh,
So
good.
mm.
Oh, just absolutely gorgeous. Like the cinematography, everything about it, the
Mhm.
heightened intensity. It's absolutely wonderful. And then
To get back into that show.
and Sam Hurst's Romancing the Gothic YouTube channel, they always, and she tries to do a bunch of things from Frankenstein to contemporary television series, anything that's vaguely horror or supernatural adjacent. Oh, our chat is just like enjoying all the Hannibal. Oh yes, the
It's a real
chemistry.
predator-prey relationship in Hannibal that I did not expect to press all my buttons, but it did.
Desiring the monster.
Yeah. I you I want to take a second to make sure that we highlight a phrase that you used in our email thread, Kristen, because that phrase just like leapt out of the screen at me as the perfect summation of why so many queer people I think are into horror. And it was, you said that horror could be used to express the inexpressible. And that just like that so simple phrase just like blew my mind. I literally wrote it down on a piece of paper on my desk so that I could just like keep that in the little place where I look at stuff when I'm writing, because that is powerful summary right there. Um, there is a question in Q&A, so I am going to only recommend one thing. And I watched it yesterday, and I loved it. I had never heard of it before, but my husband and I watched it randomly last night. And it is a movie from 2018 called Knife Plus Heart. It is a horror movie about a gay porn studio in Paris in 1979. And I think that there is one character in it who might be cishet. And otherwise, this like sprawling cast of characters is every possible queer identity and experience. It is so beautiful. It's a gorgeously made film. It is deeply felt, deeply emotional. It's also scary. It's also tragic. It's everything that I need in a horror movie and more. It is so wonderful. And ultimately it's a movie about how queer trauma leads to queer rage and the tragedy of that being set against a backdrop of a ton of queer joy and queer pleasure. It's a very complex film. Repeatedly throughout it, my husband and I kept saying, I have no idea what's going to happen, and I don't care as long as they keep showing me this movie. I don't really care where it goes. I don't really care what happens. But it turns out it has a very tidy narrative conclusion. So highly recommended. Knife Plus Heart. And also the Shudder miniseries Queer for Fear. Incredible. So, what's the question from Q&A? Oh, it came up in the thing.
You all spoke earlier about how queer fiction is having a moment where we can be more overt and less coded about our experiences. What can we as creatives do to extend that moment and turn it into a sea change instead? Can we extend it both through time and also across geography to make queerness more supported in more parts of the world?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm going to give a hopefully brief answer for me, and then I'm going to pitch it to everybody else. I think that we basically have to do what we have done in all parts of culture, which has become the caretakers and the gardeners of this part of fiction. We have to essentially just like go ahead and invade horror spaces and use those spaces to start advancing our own stories. The more queer horror writers I see show up at queer conventions, or at horror conventions rather, and show up at other kinds of horror spaces, fandom conventions in general, queer horror movie or horror film festivals, things like that. I think that the more visible we are within the horror genre, the more queer horror fans will find us, and the way that we can have conversations that sort of start drawing a bigger boundary around horror that is more inclusive and is us setting the boundaries rather than other people setting the boundaries around us. I also think, frankly, more of us need to go try to get agents and big publishers and prove that we can make money telling these stories. And I don't love that as an answer, but the more often we make a buck telling these stories, the more likely the larger forces at work in literature, whether we like it or not, will take notice and decide to listen.
And I can chime in. I was able to attend Midsummer Scream this year for on behalf of press, and there were I would say it was 75%, influenced by queer type panels, that had something to do with the LGBTQ community, and I was loving it.
Any of y'all
I
jump
agree
in?
with that. I think that in the age of the internet, as both good and bad as the internet can be, because the internet does have a tendency to create echo chambers. The good thing about the internet is that the internet has made it easier for everyone, especially for the queer and the LGBT plus community, to find a global companionship. And it's much easier for us to be able to organize and just to be able to find companions online, even in other countries. So that's allowing both creators, readers, and just everyone to find a broader sense of community than, even when I was a kid and, in the 90s when the internet loaded for 7 hours before you could even get online.
And it screamed in reaction.
Like that, though, that idea of support, community, organizing, being there for each other. The more we are there, the more we are visible, then it snowballs, right? You see other people who are like you, and you say, oh, maybe I don't have to be the lonely outsider. Maybe there's a whole community of us that are also out there. So the more we can do, the more we do show up, the more we support other queer creators. Also, if there's something you really love, post about it, comment about it, share it with other people. It is so easy to do these days. So amplifying those voices and amplifying each other, right?
Yeah.
We're
And I'd say that,
technically, oh, go ahead.
oh, real quick, I would say that goes not only for the people who are published by large traditional publishing houses, but also for those people who are published with small presses or micro presses or who are self-publishing, because they're doing it as a labor of love. They're hoping to make some money, but they're not guaranteed to. So if they can make one sale, that makes their day. If they get one positive review, one tweet, they're thrilled, and that gives them the emotional support to continue.
Absolutely.
We're technically at time, but we do have one more question. So if you can keep your answers fairly brief. Since realizing I am myself queer, I've come to understand the icon of the rainbow as being able to perceive a broader spectrum of human experience. What can horror do to help straight folk recontextualize their own experiences and understand them in broader terms?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it does because I mean many people come to recognize some part of themselves that might be a bit queer, or they recognize themselves in community with queer people, even if they don't identify specifically as gay, bi, or trans. Um, they they understand this. Oh, we're all in this together because I understand this queer creator. I maybe that's what's being said, that we can appreciate each other's art.
I
And
think that psychologically, maybe it's to, I don't know if I would defend this answer in court, but make them fear the same things that we fear and show them that it is worth fighting against those things. And that if they do that alongside us, then we can all defeat them together. I think that is a powerful motivator.
Mhm. Yeah.
that gets us the idea of heroism, right? The hero of the story sometimes can be the queer person next to you, right? Even if you're a straight person watching this or reading this, maybe you look at that and say, oh, well, anyone can be the hero of the story. Anyone can fight against some of those demons or monsters or anything else too. There's room for all those sorts of stories, and that becomes more and more normalized the more we tell them. So hopefully that's helpful, not just for the queer audiences, but for the not queer audiences as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that just horror as a vehicle is so diverse that it makes it easy for people to find something within themselves. And it doesn't matter whether you're queer or straight, it's just easy to relate to. And I I have turned friends on who to horror who have never watched horror movies in their life. And it's always through usually the dumbest types of horror movies that are meant to be campy. They're meant to be fun. They're not meant to be scary.
Okay.
I think something that horror and politics have in common is that they are both often about what we are afraid will happen and how do we prevent that? How do we push back against that? And I think if we can tell enough really political horror, which is my thing, then even people who do not have those as concerns will recognize those as concerns.
And then we all go watch Hannibal and feel all the feelings.
Exactly. Okay, we are at 12:55 Pacific time, so please continue the discussion in the Discord. Knife and Heart is on Tubi for free, so I posted the link in the Discord if anybody wants to watch it. And we'll go from there, and we'll be returning back to the power of queer normative world building here in about 30 minutes-ish.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
y'all.
much.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.